is I'm going to thank you very much for starting the recording. I would like to welcome everyone here and to give a big thanks to our two speakers today, Nigel and Rob, both from the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors in the United Kingdom. Nigel's based in England and Rob's based in Scotland. This is part of a webinar series called The Future of Work, where we've been going and hearing from different people around the world, different countries and different regions of the world. We've worked our way around to the home of ergonomics, where the term was first used and first practiced. And today we're going to hear from Nigel and Rob, and I'll just give a very quick introduction to both Nigel and Rob, and then hand over to Nigel. Nigel has his own consultancy based out of the UK, consulting to companies in the commercial and the government and the academia sector. He has over 30 years of experience in his company called Human Applications. He's also a chartered fellow of the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, a chartered member of the IOSH, and a member of a number of other organizations. He's acted as an expert witness and acted on the executive boards of a number of UK universities, including some well-known universities in the area of ergonomics and human factors, including places like Loughborough, Cranfield and Sheffield. And a bit on the side, he's an avid supporter of Leicester City, which by his own admission is at the moment is a little bit sad. Rob is a human factors engineer, and he works in a company in Glasgow, based out of Glasgow. He works largely in safety critical industries such as defense, air traffic control, cybersecurity, and the nuclear industry. And last year, and one of the reasons why Rob is here to talk to us today, he was awarded the New Ergonomist of the Year by the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors. So enough about me. I'm going to hand it over to you, Nigel, to take us away. I'm going to switch my camera off so that I don't act as a distraction.
Brilliant.
If you have any questions, one more thing. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function.
Okay. Just checking. I'm assuming that everybody can see that. Yeah.
Perfect.
Great. Look, thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. And are you going to hear from Rob in about 10-15 minutes time? But just to say thank you to everybody, particularly we started the session mentioning the CIHF, and Tina Worthy phoned me and asked me whether I'd be prepared to do it, because she was looking for a young person, an old person, to talk about the future of work. I thought, that's great. I wonder who the old person's going to be if I'm going to be speaking. Unfortunately, it turned out it was me. I'd like to also thank Murray Sinclair and Matthew Trigg. Murray for giving me a couple of really interesting articles, and Matthew Trigg for QAing my excesses of wisdom on this session. So let me begin. First of all these views are my own. So I'm not representing CIH or anybody else. But let me begin by just giving my view. I haven't been around ergonomics for 70 years, but I look back and see that in the 1940s, a lot of when ergonomics sort of started off as a discipline, it was all about white men in offices sitting at desks, and throughout the 50s and 60s, it was still about predominantly men, predominantly working in environments. We then got into mess and open plan offices, and it was all about the paperless office, and that never kind of appeared. And then we've got all the way through to today, where basically offices are all about people not being there. And I'm going to talk about some of those things and some of my views on where that is and what the future of that is. But I do want to put some context on that. A few years ago now, I was fortunate to work for an organisation called British Telecom. I worked at their research laboratories, a place called Martlesham Heath. At the time, it was the largest human factors HFE group in Europe. It was over 70 people. And I fully remember that every month we used to have like sort of debates and talks and stuff. And I remember going to one which was about what would HFE people be doing in 5 years' time when all the HFE problems had been sorted out and solved? What sort of proper jobs would we get? I also remember seeing a presentation from a guy called Stuart Card. If you're not familiar with Card, Moran and Newell, they are really part of the founding figures behind HCI. And Stu, I'm going to paraphrase him a bit, but he said, one of the problems with making computers easier to use is it fundamentally illustrates the problem of interacting with computers, interacting with technology. We make it so easy. We now find those fundamental things that underlie people's inability to get the best out of technology and interacting with it. And so that's kind of my starting point, though it's not going to be about technology, it's going to be about the challenges of HFE. I do think we have to recognize how incredibly hard it is to predict. And I've put three of my favorite predictions here. Obviously, Thomas Watson, the father of computation and one of the key leading proponents of technology in 1940s basically thought that there would be 5 computers throughout the world. IBM very generously gave the world the transistor. They patented it and let everybody use it. Daryl Zanuck also was really good at prediction. He talked about TV holding people's attention for 6 months, and then basically people will get tired of staring at a plywood box for every night, and that proved to be the case. And finally, this idea that by 2020, this is back in 1968, that Americans will work on average 26 hours a week. And as we all know, the latest data from America is that they're working more like 56 hours a week. And so I think it's incredibly difficult to figure out what's going on. I also think it's interesting that people have had kind of fictional views on where we're going to be. And we've moved from a utopian to more a dystopian view of AI and robots. I mean, Isaac Asimov took the idea that from a Czech author who talked about robots, and he did the classic robots weren't necessarily our friends. And Asimov wrote a whole series of books where robots and AI were basically great and they were our friends. However, by the time we get into the 1980s and further forward, we know that robots are not so much our friends. You know, Terminator 1 was not about a friendly robot. And AI, we see it splashed all over the headlines. It's going to destroy the world. It's the end of the world. My favorite prediction, though, my favorite predictor is a guy called H.G. Wells. And for those of you who haven't read The Time Machine or even seen the film, I think Wells predicted that the world will be divided into 2. We would have the Eloi, who would live a life of ease and luxury on the surface of the earth, where the Morlocks would live underground, tend the machinery, providing all the necessaries. And essentially, these were the people. The Morlocks were the people who allowed the Eloi to live their sybaritic existence. I have to say, if I'm going to predict the future, I see more and more jobs that are looking like Morlocks. More and more we're creating a culture of people who work in underground, tending machinery, providing the food, the clothing, the inventory that we use, whether it's people working in distribution, people working in manufacturing, people working in a whole host of industries. And I also see this vision of a future where we all work fewer hours and have more time for leisure still seems to me to be a long way off, just like the paperless office, which was happening in the 1980s. And I remember one of my ex-colleagues, a guy called Tom Stewart, saying, you know, you will have all heard it before, the paperless office is about as likely as a paperless toilet. And I think it's really, really interesting. I also think for those of you who haven't read The Time Machine, it doesn't necessarily end well for Eloi in their interaction with Morlocks. So here's where I'm starting from. The UK, it's an island, sadly no longer a member of the EU. We've got a population, maybe 70 million. The exact population is quite disputed. We are getting older. The median age is increasing significantly year on year. We're also seeing a huge disparity between old people like me, who live out in the countryside, and young people, I guess, like Rob, who live in towns and cities. We see a massive increase in the UK population of the over 60s. We're now up to 18.5%. That's going to rise and rise. We see the under 18s falling. And so essentially what we're getting is a a bunch of old grey people who are moving out of the urban environment and basically trying to interact with the world from their country estates or from their rural idyls, or more realistically from a small house in a village which probably didn't have a bus, probably didn't have a pub because it's closed, probably didn't have a shop. And I also see in the UK the 5 big employers, and it's not by money. So in other words, we know that in the UK, the service sector, finance, all of those things are actually what drives the economy. But in terms of people, transport and storage are by far the UK's largest employer. Health and social care, second. We see education and construction also as really significant employers. Sadly, not so much manufacturing. We've seen quite a fall, a decline in the number of people who are directly involved in manufacturing. And I'm going to have a look at a couple of these, and I'm going to hand on to Rob, who's going to look at some of the HF challenges around particularly the health and social care area. But let's just start off by talking about one of my big bugbears. A lot of people talk about working from home. I started from working from home. You know, I'm working from home now. We are the fortunate few. I was fortunate enough to work throughout the pandemic. I actually worked for the government. I worked for the Home Office. We had projects looking at how asylum seekers were being catered for during the pandemic. We went to all the hotels and also to what were then 2 big centres. We looked at how it went on, and the COVID pandemic basically highlighted a fundamental disparity. There are a bunch of people who are fortunate enough to be able to work from home. They are the massive minority. The rest of the people, whether they were bus drivers, train drivers, whether they were nurses, whether they were lorry drivers, whether they worked in distribution, picking for stuff, whether in supermarkets serving us, the vast majority of people could not work from home. If you are a forklift truck driver, you had 2 options during the pandemic, which is you worked from home on furlough, 80% of your salary if you were lucky, or you worked in your distribution center. You couldn't work on your forklift truck in your back garden. And what we see in the UK is that transport and storage is by far the fastest growing part of the UK. And that is true right now, post-COVID, but actually it's been the long-term trend. We see more and more distribution centers. We see more and more fulfillment centers. We see more and more people driving lorries, driving trucks, driving forklifts throughout the UK. And it's basically clear that if we look at the way in which technology has developed in that area, more and more people are doing more and more tough jobs. Picking, loading, unloading, driving. And what we see is the impact of robotics has been that we've got rid of people for the really easy stuff. The stuff that's easy to automate, the stuff that is easy for people to basically to be separate from, we've automated. And what we've left with is the really hard stuff, the stuff it's really difficult to automate, the stuff it's really difficult to perform. And those jobs that are left tend to be tough on both the mind and the body. They can be mind-numbingly dumb in terms of repetitive, really hard to sort of stimulate people, and they can be hard also on our body. People walk literally tens of miles doing these jobs, and I think if I look at the human factors ergonomics challenges there, I think there are sort of 5 things that we really need to think about. First of all, what is the impact both on the physical, mental, and we can argue societal, sociological impacts of long hours? If you're now working 11, 12-hour shifts, actually those long hours really seem to be tough. And as people get older, we think they might be harder. We work with a lot of distribution companies, and clearly there are issues around age, where you don't want to discriminate against older people. But if you want an interesting insight into some of the challenges, I would suggest that you Google Amazon's interview with the Parliamentary Select Committee that happened back end of last year, where they were challenged about some of these issues about long hours and older people. We also know night shift is particularly challenging. There's been some work from various research centres indicating night shifts might be related to increasing things like cancers. And I think that's a really big challenge. What is night shift? What effect does it have on our body? And I think there's still a lot of questions there. Repetitive work can be really challenging as well. We know that, in the old days, musculoskeletal disorders were called repetitive strain injuries for the reason that they appear to occur on people who had repetitive jobs. We think repetitive work might be correlated with all sorts of musculoskeletal issues. We also think that these jobs typically attract low pay. In the UK, we have something of a shortage, which Andrew pointed out. We're really struggling to get people into some of our distribution centres. We're really struggling with some of our drivers, and that's because in the past we relied upon paying people less money from Europe to come and do jobs in the UK, because our minimum wage tended to be higher than some of our Eastern European countries. So people came over. When they've disappeared, we've still got the low pay. We just haven't got the people. And we also see that people typically work on these things called pick rates, which tell you how many items you have to pick every minute, every second even, and certainly every hour. And these are often incentivized. If you don't make the pick, something can happen to you. You might not earn your money, you might get put on probation, you might get disciplined. And I think all of these are really big challenges for HFE people. I think actually trying to change culture, doing the research, working out what's going on. So I think I'm suggesting that we need to do more research on things like shift work. I think the proactive management of musculoskeletal disorders is a huge challenge, and better understanding of the role of design in that. And I think we should be launching campaigns to challenge the use of monitoring pick rates and incentivized targets, because I think they do compromise long-term occupational health. So I think we've also got some challenges in health and social care around innovation, around AI. I think we've got challenges in supporting elderly people, particularly keeping them out of the care system. And I think we need to do other things. But I'm not going to bang on about this, because I'm going to ask Rob to talk about the wonders of AI and in the healthcare sector. Rob, over to you.
Hello, thank you. Let me get my screen share working. Is that visible?
Yep, can see that.
Yep. Okay, bro. Yeah, as Nigel mentioned, I'm going to do a bit of an overview of specifically healthcare today. So from the UK's perspective, this is very much focused on our National Health Service, the NHS, and the way it might be integrated within their long-term plan in terms of how they evolve and move on in future, and then how human factors and ergonomics can be sort of instrumental to integrating that and making sure that we alleviate any issues that AI might bring with it. So I will briefly go over why I've picked artificial intelligence in particular. I'll summarize what the NHS is, the benefits that it proposes, any particular challenges that might come with integrating AI within a healthcare setting, and then also our role specifically as human factors practitioners. So we're seeing more and more in safety critical industries within the UK. Lots of companies are looking at how they can best exploit AI, and there's an awful lot of research at the moment seeing how it can best be used. So for example, in rail, Network Rail have been looking at how AI could potentially detect hazards on railway tracks. Air traffic control, Project Bluebird with NATS have been looking at how AI can be used to optimize flight plans. Defence have established the Defence AI Centre to understand how they can best use AI to support decision making and lots of other things which they haven't publicly disclosed, understandably. And then finally in healthcare, the NHS are looking at how they can use it to help with diagnosis, treatment and triaging of patients. So a quick summary of the NHS. It's been around since the late 40s in the UK. It's the primary publicly funded healthcare system. It's free at the point of treatment. It covers everything from everyday doctor's appointments all the way through to surgery and post-operative care. So it offers the full gamut of care needed for life-saving and preventative care. However, although it's publicly revered. There are an awful lot of ongoing issues which come with a system this big and this old. Some of the pertinent ones include a very large waiting list. So for NHS England alone, we've got a waiting list of about 7.5 million patients. On average, they're spending about 14 weeks on that waiting list between being referred and actually receiving treatment. And then on the staffing perspective, we're seeing over 110,000 vacancies for secondary care. So this is specialist care after the primary point of contact, usually within clinics or hospitals. We're seeing significant understaffing. And some of the knock-on effects from that are we're seeing staff with more and more symptoms of burnout and very, very high workload impacting their well-being, to the point where just under 21% of all sickness absences in the NHS are attributed to poor mental health. So how does AI tie into this? Well, the NHS long-term plan has been discussing artificial intelligence and machine learning for quite a long time now, wanting to become world leaders in using it, understanding how it can be integrated to try and alleviate some of the issues which I've just mentioned. So one example, they did a pilot demo at Moorfields Eye Hospital in the UK. And they found that it made the correct referral decision and diagnosis of over 50 different eye diseases with about a 94-95% accuracy rate, which tended to match the world's best eye experts. So it offered a lot of promise in those sort of areas. The main benefits that AI can offer are that it does process an awful lot of data, very complex data, relatively quickly. And that in turn can mean lower wait times for the patient. It can alleviate the workload of the specialists who have to, say, review X-ray scans, for example. It offers them a second opinion. It offers some decision-making support. It offers input which doesn't necessarily require years of training of, say, a staff member. It just gives that nice second opinion so that they can bounce their ideas off of it and understand if they've got the sort of right level of thinking and whether they've made the right decision with the diagnosis. It also can be used flexibly. So it's not just diagnosis, it's not just treatment. There have also been several studies looking at how it could potentially be used in triaging patients and, say, accident and emergency rooms, understanding who should be prioritized for care and how to potentially reduce the workload on the staff who work in A&E departments where their workload is already very, very high in a very high pressure environment. And in turn, whilst we're also potentially seeing staff workload reductions that could come from this, it could also reduce training demand. So several years ago, most healthcare systems in the world wouldn't allow nurses to prescribe medication. But with the advent of different tools and technology, we've got programs which now understand which drugs interact with each other. For example, they'll highlight what the patient can and can't have based on their medical history. We've actually been able to bridge that gap where a nurse then is able to safely prescribe a drug in place of what was traditionally relied upon a doctor to do. So what AI might do is something similar where we can start to bridge those sort of experience and training gaps by offering a technological sort of solution to fill that gap, as it were. Some examples, one that was big in the news a little while ago was Google's DeepMind. Google DeepMind developed something called AlphaFold, which predicted the shape of proteins within the human body. This has traditionally been a really, really difficult thing to do with traditional experimental methods in terms of understanding how proteins are shaped and thus how we can treat certain conditions. The database when they started DeepMind was about 1 million proteins had been mapped. With the advent of AI and using DeepMind, they've now got a database of over 214 million protein structures. So this is really, really promising for treatments for quite common diseases such as diabetes or, say, something like sickle cell disease. So it's really, really important from the NHS's perspective in terms of understanding how this can be used for preventative care. Another example, which was published in The Lancet recently, was breast cancer screening. So they found that AI, when twinned with radiologists, had a very, very high accuracy rate for detecting tumours in breast cancer patients who've been screened. and they found that false positive rate was very, very similar to actual radiologists, being at about 1.5%. And a notable quote that came off the back of this study when it was reported in the BBC from the president of the Royal College of Radiologists was that there is a shortfall in radiologists at the moment. There's staffing is considerably under what it needs to be, at around 29%. And what AI offers is potentially saving them an awful lot of time and maximizing their efficiency by offering that support and decision making and identifying who needs care right now and how we can prioritize who gets what. So some challenges then for integrating this very exciting new tool into a healthcare setting. Well, first of all, it's going to depend on the data that you put into it in the first place. So data bias and inequity of care is a really, really big issue that we need to be mindful of. We've already seen in the US back in 2019, an algorithm was used, sorry, my cat wants to get involved. An algorithm was used to understand which patients should be prioritized for different types of healthcare to ensure that there's better preventative care. And the way that the AI interpreted the data was that people who historically spent more money on healthcare were sicker because they were attending hospitals more, they were in for more visits. And it turned out people who could spend more money tended to be middle-class white patients. So as a result, the algorithm decided that Black patients were, in comparison, healthier, thus they were deprioritized for care. And it's something like this where we really, really need to be careful with what goes in will affect what comes out of it. And we need to understand the logic that it adopts when it comes to certain decisions. And there's always that element of having a human in the loop to understand the logic that it's bringing into this. So that brings me on to my next point, which is transparency, having the right conceptual and mental models for how something as complex as AI works. As I mentioned earlier, it processes a huge amount of fairly complicated data fairly quickly, and it can spot patterns which humans can't necessarily spot. So when it's offering a suggestion for diagnosis or treatment, for example, it needs to accurately convey to the human operator, this is how I've reached my decision, this is the logic I've adopted. So it's something that we really need to consider, because if it's going through thousands of data points and it's spotting things that researchers at the moment can't currently spot, how do we find a way to communicate that effectively? There's then the issue of over and under trust. So if we undertrust something, then we never really fully get the benefit of something as exciting as AI and something as powerful as AI. There's also observed phenomena already in a healthcare setting, things like alarm fatigue, where alarms that have been designed to indicate something quite serious tend to be ignored by healthcare professionals because they're going off all the time. So you get this sort of cry wolf effect as a result. On the other end, overtrust is a very, very big issue in itself, where if we become complacent and overly reliant on a tool, then we might start to see more false positives slip through the net. And as a result, that will impact patient safety in the long run. And then finally, there's the question of ethics. So in terms of overall accountability for someone's health, we have healthcare professionals who take a Hippocratic oath when they become doctors. You know, how does something as complex as artificial intelligence, which sure is a tool, but it does also act like a team member in some respects, how are we ensuring that overall accountability still sits with the human practitioner? So some examples then. Specifically, I want to talk about trust and bias, like I just mentioned with the overtrust and undertrust. One example for Therac 25 in the 80s, it was a radiation therapy machine. It tended, well, I say it tended, on several occasions, it administered lethally high doses of radiation, massive doses of radiation, way beyond the parameters of what it was meant to administer to patients. Whilst in safety reviews, this was eventually chalked up to issues in the way that the software was coded, there was a human element in terms of automation bias, where the healthcare practitioners operating the machines tended to expect the machine to know what it was doing and not really question its behavior or check the feedback of the system very much. And there was this tendency to rely on it as something that was fairly infallible, and it was going to consistently deliver the same result each time. Outside of healthcare, something more recent, things like the Tesla assisted driving feature, or as most people call it, the autopilot feature, even though it's not autopilot. There is a tendency for people's mental models to be quite inaccurate in terms of how this works. And we've seen quite a few headlines like this now where the driver would be reading or watching a movie because they've left the Tesla to drive for them. And there is a tendency for us to sort of anthropomorphize technology like this, where we treat it almost as a chauffeur rather than a range of sensors, radars, cameras that are trying to make a predictive model based on the data that's incoming, but it's not going to be behaving in the same way that a human would. So in terms of the role of human factors within integrating AI, I think a really big point is training. How we team healthcare practitioners with AI, with human machine teaming. The overall experience design when interacting with AI. And then the safety accountability that comes off the back of those factors. So delving a bit more into that, on the training and human machine teaming side, I think the key points to remember here are that the AI does tend to adapt over time and it responds to its environment. It has a lot of tacit knowledge and tacit learning. If it gets something wrong, it'll learn from that and it'll adapt the way that it operates in response. It's not a typical tool where it's going to produce the same output every single time. It is something that will grow and evolve depending on its environment. As a result, although we're using it as a tool and something that is going to support decision making, there might be a tendency for some staff to start viewing it more as a human team member, almost similar to what I just showed with the Tesla example, where because of the way that it's coming to certain conclusions, or perhaps the way that it's producing outputs, whether it's using things like natural language processing, people might start to treat it more as a person. And as a result, we get those trust issues, which we just spoke about. And we need to understand that it's not infallible. It will make mistakes. We've seen with very, very popular tools like ChatGPT this year, when it first became available to the public, it was hailed as something that was very, very good, very convincing and very accurate. And then over the last few months, there tends to have been a bit of a drift in terms of the accuracy of the data that it's producing. And they found a lot of phenomena such as, they call it AI hallucination, where it reaches a certain conclusion, it produces an answer with no clear indication of how it's come to a certain answer, no explanation of its logic, and the answer is often patently wrong in what it's responded with. So these are all factors that we need to take into account when we're training people on how to use these systems. They're not team members, they are tools. Although there is a tendency to treat them like people because of the way that they respond to their environment and the way that they operate, we do need to remember that at the end of the day, the human in the room is the healthcare practitioner. So the NHS has adopted some interesting language changes in response to this. So in one of the NHS's white papers on artificial intelligence, they've started to steer away from the word trust. They feel that trust is more of a sort of binary concept. Something is either trustworthy or untrustworthy. What the NHS would rather do is use something like confidence, which is more of a sliding scale. You can have low confidence that something works effectively, or you can have high confidence. And it doesn't necessarily bind you to a certain box when it comes to using a tool like AI, which in itself is very fluid as a tool, and it won't always produce the same result time and time again. So it's more about understanding when you're using it, whether you're going, I think I've got good confidence that it's giving me the right data, rather than going, I trust it. Because again, it's offering that sort of level of anthropomorphism, which I think we need to avoid. From the experience design and user trials side of things, I think really important factors, which I've gone over a few times already: transparency, understanding the logic that artificial intelligence is using and how it comes to certain conclusions before we act on the knowledge that it's given us. Being mindful of the fact that it's got tacit learning. It is responding to its context, responding to its environment, and changing its parameters as a result. That the input and output modality is something that we need to consider when designing these systems from an HF perspective. When we use things like natural language processing, when we talk to artificial intelligence as if it were a person, and it responds as if it were a person, does that affect the way that we're going to interact with it and utilize it as a tool? And then finally, things like cultural differences when we're interacting directly with patients, how comfortable they're going to be having artificial intelligence help deliver their care, and then more localized changes such as dialects, accents, that kind of thing. My partner is Glaswegian. We have a Google Home. It always understands me. It never understands him. So although that's a really basic point, it is something that we do need to consider when we're looking at rolling something like AI out to a very, very wide network, such as the NHS, which is covering not just England, also Scotland, also Wales, also Northern Ireland. And then finally, safety and confidence. So when it comes to things like safety analysis, before we deploy something like AI into the field from lab conditions, say we're doing a bow tie such as this. So we're looking at the chance of a hazard occurring. So say an AI fails to identify cancer, so it produces a false negative response. And as a result, there'll be a delay in treatment. So some of the causes for that could be that it mistakenly identifies a tumor as healthy tissue, or the scan that was given to the AI was quite low resolution, which produced an error like this. But say once it's been deployed into the field and say it produces a false positive. So say we're doing a prostate scan and it identifies someone's femur as a prostate tumor, and the healthcare practitioner says to the AI, no, that's incorrect. That is the patient's femur. You got that wrong. That's a false positive. It might then adjust its parameters so that it becomes a little less sensitive to what it's scanning in future. And as a result, we might see a higher likelihood of false negatives. So the way that we interact with artificial intelligence may in turn affect the likelihood of certain hazards occurring. Sorry, I do realize that the formatting on that slide's gone a little bit funny, but hopefully I got the point across anyway. So in conclusion, I do think that this could really, really help the NHS in terms of reducing wait times, training demands for staff, and also reducing that very, very high workload burden on very overworked staff at the moment. And as a result, that benefit can be passed on to the patients. I do think that human factors is going to be an essential part of integrating AI into that field. We need to understand how healthcare practitioners are going to interact with artificial intelligence, whether they're going to implicitly trust it or whether it's more of a confidence thing, and how we can steer them more towards having a level of confidence with a tool rather than a level of trust with what they're perceiving as a team member or a person. And it produces a very, very interesting point for human factors, where it's not just an automated system anymore. It's sitting in a strange gray area between being a tool and being a person in terms of the way that it behaves. And it presents very interesting and new challenges for us designing for these things in future. So I do think that there's a very, very promising and exciting opportunity for HF to sort of set the direction for how we can team artificial intelligence and specialists within healthcare. And I believe that is me for now. So Nigel, I will hand back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Brilliant. So folks, just to close out after that fantastic session from Rob, I want to just do this, which is my final thoughts on a couple of other areas. I think looking at education, I think there could be a real impact of artificial intelligence here. I do think, though, there are challenges. My daughter is she works for a university, and one of the things that the university is now really keen on is how do students actually interact. If there's too much homeworking, one of the joys of university is the ability to interact with people from different views, different cultures, different sorts of background. And how do we facilitate that if so much of the learning is done online, or if so much of the learning is done outside of the normal sort of social norm? Also, we can see that there's real pressure on student-teacher ratios, and that's true across from primary school all the way up to tertiary education, where we see there's a huge rise in the number of students that teachers, lecturers, demonstrators, whatever they are, have to facilitate. I also think that there's a real issue around how do we make social media more benign. It is very clear that a lot of young people particularly have quite significant mental health problems that may be caused by or exacerbated by social media, by their profile, by how they interact with people, what they read, what they do. And I'm a big believer in how do we teach even really quite young kids some of the basic stuff about stats, about maths, about understanding how to be actively curious. I'm still appalled that so many people have such a poor grasp of statistics and of those basic kind of numeracy things. And I am astonished that we can function in a modern world without understanding some of the basic things around statistics. Worth mentioning, I spend quite a lot of time working with organizations who are heavily involved in construction. And for those of you from the UK, it's likely to be a major part of the UK economy. It's one of the ways in which we're making sure that there are jobs for people. It's likely that AI and automation will have a big impact here, because what we see is we see companies finding ways to save money by things like off-site assembly, by automating parts of the construction process. So I think there's some really interesting human factors challenges around construction. We know in the UK it is a major killer. If we look at our data around work-related fatalities, we can see that construction is always part of the story. And it is still the case that too many people die working in construction, whether it's on site, whether it's getting to site or whatever. We also see that some of the challenges around construction are likely to raise quite significant human factors, ergonomics issues. So some of the prefab stuff, some of the building materials, things like the green initiatives, they're all going to raise quite big HFE issues. And I have to say, one of the more depressing things after my career in HFE is the fact that we're still seeing so many bolt-on issues. And just a very specific example from the UK, we have things called smart motorways. A few years ago now, the UK looked at making more efficient use of our motorway network, which are 3-lane carriages where the national speed limit applies. And all of our 3-lane carriages, three-lane roadways, they all had an inner lane which was designed to be constantly free until somebody broke down, in which case they use this hard shoulder, so-called, or the 4th lane. The UK government looked at making our motorways wider, and they realized it was incredibly expensive and there wasn't really the appetite. What they came up with, though, was the idea that this 4th lane could be used, and essentially we created something called all-lane running. And it turns out that that was not necessarily the smartest decision. There are really safe ways of using all-lane running, but we have things like people don't understand it. We have something called red X's, which are basically motorway signals that appear as a big red X. And if that red X is there, you can't be in that lane. They interviewed a whole heap of drivers, and more than 50% of them had no idea what a red X meant. Now, you think how safety critical it is. If a red X appears, it's likely when you are doing 70 miles an hour in the inside lane, a red X indicated that there is a stationary vehicle ahead of you. Not understanding that that's what the sign means has had in the past catastrophic effects. We also see the behaviors of drivers fundamentally not understanding how to drive safely on motorways. And we see that we're designing motorways which are more complicated to use. They've got more complicated signage, and people's behaviors do not reflect the fact that they're driving on this kind of motorway in a lethal weapon. I want to close out though by saying three things. First of all, predicting is hard. I started off by saying, you know, my first job was looking at what I was going to do when all the HFE problems have been solved in 5 years' time. I still think we are unlikely to solve HFE problems in the next 5 years. I'm fairly optimistic that Rob will have a job for the whole of his career. I think people are highly unlikely to change, though. I think their physical and cognitive capacities are going to be pretty much as they were when ergonomics was founded. When we're looking at how that mismatch between what people were physically and mentally able to do and what we expected them to do. You know, I go all the way back to those of you who remember the Cranfield Man, where those lovely people at Cranfield designed a human being to operate a lathe, and it turns out that such people don't exist. I think that's still going to be the case. I think we have to recognize that work will continue to be more than just an exchange of time for money, that people go to work for social reasons, for all sorts of stimulating reasons. And actually, not only are we're not going to become a nation of home workers. I don't think that can exist. As I have already illustrated, most of the jobs, most of the areas in the UK where people work are not going to be home working. But I do think also those who are confined to work at home need to recognize that actually I think the long-term impacts of home working we're not even beginning to explore yet. And I think there'll be huge, profound implications if you're a home worker in 5 years' time for your networks, for your opportunities, for your socialization. And we know that every time a new technology is introduced, there's new HFE challenges, because all the time we're trying to bolt on rather than build in. And then my final thought is from a guy called John Galsworthy. He is an English novelist, and he provided a quote. So basically, why do we think about the future? Because if you don't think about the future, you can't have one. So on that bombshell, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude. We've been Rob, I've been Nigel, and it's now over to you. So I will stop my screen sharing. I see there's quite a few questions, thank goodness, all aimed at Rob. So over to you, Andrew.
Well, they're not all aimed at Rob, but I'm gonna focus on Rob's ones to start off with. Thanks very much, Nigel and Rob. Very interesting, very thought-provoking. As some of our audience has also noted. A question directly for Rob. One of the things you talked about was this issue about the data and the data bias, and how that leads to, in your example, inequity in care, particularly because the data coming in was showing that one group was getting healthcare and therefore were more in need of healthcare. Is there anything that HFE practitioners and researchers can do to help identify solutions to address that data bias issue?
Yes, I say that tentatively. A lot of algorithms, well, that particular one was being fed historical data. So I think from that perspective, there's perhaps a little bit of validation to be work to be done from our perspective. But I think for developing future AI models, it's a case of ensuring proper user-centered design and design thinking in terms of when we're delivering a solution like this, it's got to address the needs of all of the potential end users and, in this case, patients. So I think a core tenet to that is ensuring that the cross-section of people that it's going to be serving is represented in early stage development to make sure that they're accounted for from the beginning, and so that it's not a bolt-on at the end where we then have to go back in and ask the AI to stop prioritizing one certain demographic group over another. It's more about making sure that it's sort of baked in from the beginning when we're in the development stage, and making sure that HF is there from the very beginning when we're looking at producing these models. Easier said than done. We do tend to get bolted on. But I think that's a really core bit, is that user-centered design aspect and making sure that all demographics are covered.
Yeah, it's showing perhaps the importance of HFE work in the design of information that's fed
Yes.
into AI systems from the very beginning. So HFE inputs at that information design point. We've seen that come up in a number of other areas in the past, most recently with, for example, what appears on the front page of a website, for example. Right, here's a question from Hannah Barton. This is a question from across the Atlantic. Again, I sort of focused towards Rob, and this is it's a tough question. What do you see are the organizational challenges that HFE can tackle with respect to implementing AI tools? You mentioned the need to ensure individual practitioners are accountable. How do we ensure that the latent organizational factors, which also have a big impact on patient and safety care outcomes, how do they get accounted for when AI is involved?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there's perhaps going to be a little bit of a tendency, especially in areas where there's understaffing, for middle management to see AI as kind of a golden goose where we can start replacing practitioners rather than, as I said during the presentation, rather than using it as a tool, seeing it as a substitute for a practitioner. And I think that's really dangerous ground. So I think from a culture point of view, it is very much asserting that this is technology, it is a tool. It's not a replacement for the human in the loop, as it were. So maybe it's an education piece just to spell out just how these things operate and the benefit they're intended to provide, but also the bounds of their responsibility and how that will impact overall ethics. Sorry, that was a bit of a convoluted answer, but it's a really, really good question. It's something I want to think about a bit more, I think.
It's a tough one because, the way in which AI has been implemented in many organizations has been around an issue of trying to reduce risk for humans. So from an organizational perspective, whereas the perspective you are talking about in the NHS sector is to try to fill an employee gap or a skills gap. So you don't have enough people, and so you need to be able to do things like shorten queues. And the way in which you speed up that process is by using AI tools, which is a little bit different to other types of AI contexts. So that does make it very interesting. Yeah. Here's a question for both of you. It's again, this is a tough question coming from Simon Rosser. You mentioned the importance of ethics. So a question for both panelists, and there may be different cultural and societal ethical standards. How do we incorporate these ethics into occupational health and safety systems, or into AI, or into ergonomics, so we create some sort of standard?
So I think a couple of things. First of all, I think if you look at the UN Global Compact, those 10 principles within the Global Compact definitely have quite a lot to say that are ergonomics issues. So things like human rights, I'm a big, I think ergonomics can do a lot there. But when you look at things like labor standards, when you look at the things that are in there about how businesses should be run ethically, I think that's something which the whole world can potentially sign up to. There's obviously things like the Ethical Trading Initiative as well, where we can try to see standards in things like manufacturing sectors, food, clothing, and drive up those things. I mean, I've been involved in working for a very, very large manufacturing company, doing training and audits for their supply chain. And I think things like those frameworks by the UN, by the ETI, are really important, because although we do have different ethical standards, I think there are some things that actually we all ought to sign up to. So things like not having kids sewing shoes and footballs, things like not having forced labor, basically making sure that we don't discriminate. I took out some of my education views on advisement from my colleague Matt, who I mentioned at the beginning. But I also think that we are closing down opportunities for critical thinking. I think once any society starts banning books, I think we have quite significant challenges on the ethics front, and I think that will bleed into ergonomics, because I think I want practitioners now who've been exposed to the widest possible set of life, so they can think differently. I mean, what do we bring to any problem? We bring thinking like an ergonomist. That's what our skill is. And I think the more we create closure on the more we try and bound people on that thinking, the worse ergonomists we become. But that's just my view.
Diversity, interesting. Rob, do you want to add to that?
I don't have a huge amount to add. I think I agree with pretty much all the points made. There is some universally, I think, agreed points of general ethics that we should work towards and perhaps codify and make universal in that respect. I think it's important to notice when we are drifting into unethical territory and be able to effectively stand up to that. We've seen it in UX in particular, in terms of adjacent industries, where you see what got termed as dark UX patterns, things like signing up to newsletters and that kind of thing. I don't know if you've ever seen the box where it's got a big paragraph, and at the end of it, it says, if you don't want to receive the newsletter, please tick this box. Whereas typically you would expect to tick the box to sign yourself in. So they've kind of deliberately sort of preyed upon that, and you start to see, I know it's a very sort of meek example, but you start to see examples of where that knowledge of usability is used for the dark side, as it were. I think it's really important to understand our limits there.
We saw you signed up for a free internet free internet service, and in ticking the box, you agreed to give your firstborn over to the people who provide the service. And you know, that seems fair to me.
Depending on whether you like your firstborn or not, but that's it. That does seem fair. Yes. Rob, I know you have to go fairly shortly, so I've tried to schedule the questions in a way in which the ones are focused mostly at Nigel, so feel free to drop off if you need to. This is I think a deliberately provocative question, given what you were saying about manufacturing in the UK. But what sort of futuristic technologies can HFE expect in the automotive sector, given how big the automotive sector used to be in the UK? Yes. Or whether there is a future for the automotive sector in the UK?
I think it's a great question. In the UK, I'm not sure. I mean, when we started human applications, we worked a lot in the motor sector, not in terms of the car manufacturers, but people like seat manufacturers, people who did other bits of cars, you know, dashboards and stuff. And I've seen that largely disappear. Whether that is going to continue, I don't know. I mean, clearly, I think car manufacturers are incredibly innovative about getting people out. If you look at how many people used to be employed in manufacturing a car and look at how few people are now involved in manufacturing a car, I think that trend will continue. I think the large car manufacturers, not just in the UK, but everywhere, are all about getting rid of people, which is, you know, improves quality and improves consistency, etc. I think that trend will continue. So what do I expect to see? I expect to see fewer and fewer people producing more and more cars, and I think that trend will be exacerbated by AI, by new technologies. What those will be, I don't know.
Yeah, we can, if we look at, for example, the automotive sectors in the Far East, it's largely been automation and robotics that have used to remove the humans from the manufacturing side of things, if not necessarily the design side of things. But yeah, here's Rob had to drop off, and I see this question was probably Rob and Nigel, so maybe I should have tackled that one first. But anyway, Nigel, maybe over to you, because Hannah's second question does focus at saying a lot of the challenges that you listed were not necessarily specific to HFE. They're large societal challenges.
Yeah.
or around economic incentives. For example, the one I can't remember, the pick, what was it?
Pick rate, yeah.
Pick rates, yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
And things like that. So what do you see as HFE's role in looking at these issues?
I mean, I think one of the things that we can be quite good at, and how do we sell ourselves to organizations, is certainly in the UK. If you're a large manufacturer, if you're a large distributor, if you get it wrong, then we've finally recognized that the cost of failure it has to discourage companies from doing the wrong thing. So actually, if you kill people and injure people in the UK, you can get significant fines, you can get sued for a lot of money. And I think one of the things that we can do is, first of all, we can deal with the consequences of poor design by effectively making sure that the sinner pays. So if you are a large distribution company, if you kill somebody or injure somebody, there has to be consequence. But what we're much better at is we can actually sell ourselves to say we can do avoidance. What can we do? We can help people design workstations better. We can help design work processes better. We can look at systems and say this is where we think the failures will be, and we can offer a service that says if you use us, we can really benefit your organization. My first grown-up job in ergonomics, working for a very large UK manufacturing company, was to do create something called the business case for ergonomics. I see that sporadically every 5 years or so, we get another business case, and I'm very skeptical of them. However, I do think that most companies respond to the cost of bad human factors rather than the joy of putting human factors in first. I wish that I could say that over the last sort of few years, I've been less of a sticking plaster and more of a we can make your world a better place. I haven't seen it. I'm still optimistic. I still believe that companies that are insightful, that don't harm people, will use us. But I also see the big driver as being failures, whether it's safety failures, whether it's musculoskeletal disorder failures, or whether it's failure of a process where they're producing the wrong thing. I still think that's where we continue to be used.
Yeah, I heard some in putting together a document for the IEA on the value of HFE to C-suite people. I heard some really wonderful stories about HFE having to come in too late and how much more it costs to fix things later when we're being responsive as opposed to being inserted early into the process. So I think I fully agree with you there. I see we've come to the end of our session and the end of the questions that have come up. So formally on behalf of the IEA, I would like to thank both you, Nigel, and Rob, who's had to drop off. And of course, to thank our attendees. I see Murray's name has appeared in there, so Murray definitely came on. I don't know if he heard your thanks right at the very beginning, so I'll just repeat that to make sure that Murray was included. For those of you who didn't catch everything, in a couple of days' time, we will have a recording of this session available on IEA's YouTube channel. If you just go onto YouTube and you type in International Ergonomics Association, you'll find it. Otherwise, if you're able to quickly search up in the chat, you'll find it was one of the first things that I posted in the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to stop the recording now and thank everyone. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
How do I stop? I don't actually see the recording. Maggie, are you on?